Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar on Making Your Claim. I'm Natalie Sweet. I'm the Learning Community Facilitator for the History 113-114 Learning Community. This webinar that we're going to be going through tonight is going to help you tackle your first milestone, Milestone 1. Why is Milestone 1 so important? Well, Milestone 1 helps you set up your thesis statement, which is what is going to guide your paper, your final project paper. It's also going to help you put an event description together so that you can begin to think about key people, places, and things that should appear within your final project paper. When we're talking about the claim, that's what we're talking about. When we're talking about that thesis statement, that is your claim. So what is a claim? Well, we'll go over this first so you understand what your claim, what your thesis is going to be doing within your paper. The claim of your paper should directly answer your research question. Now, that's one thing I want to make certain that everyone is clear on as we begin. Remember, your final project paper must address the research question that appeared within your e-materials. Are you having trouble finding your research question? If you actually go to the left-hand column of your class, you're going to see a little tab called Final Project Research Kit. Click on that. You're going to see the various topics that were possible for you to choose from, and you're also going to see that your research question is provided there for you. So that's one thing you want to think about as you begin to work on your claim. What is that research question? Because it should be on your mind as you work on this paper from the beginning to the end. The claim of your paper should also provide direction to your paper. It is ultimately what guides the paper. The evidence that you pull, all of that is going to come back to support your claim. It's also going to help your reader understand, what is this writer trying to show me? It's going to tell your reader too what you will prove within your paper. And it should also be a statement that must be defended with evidence. So you can't be making generic statements. You shouldn't make a statement that anybody could agree with. Instead, your claim, your thesis statement should be a statement that if you said out loud, there's the possibility for someone to say, okay, tell me more. I need to hear more about this before I'm certain that I believe this statement. In other words, it should be a statement that must be defended with evidence. How do you go about making your claim? Well, the first thing you want to do is consider your research question. So let's talk about that first. Now, for the purposes of this, you have a research question that has already been put together for you. I'm going to use a research question that actually cannot be found in History 113 or 114. It's just a sample research question that I've put together. And this is what's guiding my research. And that is, what was Northern opinion of Mary Todd Lincoln during the Civil War? Now, if you're in History 113 or 114, you're probably not covering this very topic right now, or you may have referenced Abraham Lincoln at least, but Mary Todd Lincoln was the wife of President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. And I need to be diving into this question, what was Northern opinion of her during the Civil War? Once I have my research question in mind, then I need to think about my primary and secondary sources. And you've had the opportunity to do this through the primary source quizzes and secondary source quizzes and the short answer sections in chapters 1 and 3 of your e-materials. But go back and visit them again. Good quick place to do that is that final project research kit that I mentioned earlier in the webinar. Go through and look through those sources. After a preliminary read through these sources, think about your research question and then ask yourself, what's your conclusion? What truth have you arrived at? For the purposes of this question, let's say I've looked at several primary and secondary sources that are related to Mary Todd Lincoln, and I've decided that my initial claim is that, okay, well, Northern opinion of Mary Lincoln was low during the Civil War. Now, this is something you need to note. This statement does directly respond to my research question. And it does beg the question, though, why? Why was it low? What is my evidence for why Northern opinion was low of Mary Todd Lincoln? Now, as you are working on this assignment, please note you're going to be doing it within your e-materials, and you're going to have several templates that provide prompts for you. So in one section, it's going to ask you to provide evidence. So how do you find evidence that will support your initial claim? This is when I would say review your sources again for evidence. You've looked through them once, go back and look again. Now you've got your initial statement and say, okay, what pieces of evidence, 3 pieces of evidence, can I bring forward to support this initial claim? As you look through your sources, look for facts. Now the image that you see here is actually from a newspaper article from 1862, and within it, it is talking about Mary Todd Lincoln. Now when I say facts, what do I mean? Don't make assumptions. You need hard evidence. You need evidence that is indisputable. So, for example, if we look at this newspaper article, we will see that it's talking about a grand party that was given by Mrs. Lincoln at the White House. And we notice that it talks about she had an expensive dress, it cost several $100s. Then you see complaints about we have heavy taxes to pay. Not that any loyal person shrinks from an increase in taxes, but we do dislike the putting on of airs. So, in other words, we see that in this newspaper article, they are taking issue with her spending habits and this expensive party that she has. So, those are some indisputable facts. Here are some reasons that within a primary source, someone is saying, this is why this particular person is not fond of Mrs. Lincoln. And I want you to keep some things in mind too as you look at your sources. Here are some big points. First of all, whenever you're looking at primary and secondary sources, you always want to consider the author of the source. Why are we doing this? Well, this comes when you begin to actually write your paper, then you're going to be able to really look for important key information that's going to add to the analysis of your paper. So consider who the author was. And this is someone who was writing in, and was a newspaper called the Washington Star. 2, when you think about the author, consider if the person has any biases. Now, don't think of biases necessarily as being bad thing. We all have biases. We have been through circumstances in our lives. We have lived through times that make us see the world around us in a particular way. And we look at the world in ways that maybe people who lived in different circumstances, maybe they wouldn't look at the same circumstance in the same way. So we have to consider those biases. And then what we need to consider is how these points, thinking about these points, helps us to think about the source. So there's another tip as you're moving forward. Now that you've done this, you want to begin to pull evidence together to support your claim. So let's revisit that initial claim again. Northern opinion of Mary Lincoln was low during the Civil War. But why? Here are 3 pieces of evidence we have pulled once we looked at our primary and secondary sources. And this is a good place for me too to remind you, you should only be using the primary and secondary sources that can be found within your e-materials and in that final project research kit. You shouldn't bring in outside sources, nothing from history.com, nothing from wikipedia.com. It should only come from those provided sources. So for supporting evidence 1, we have this piece of evidence. You've read through your sources and you realize, okay, well, some of her relatives fought for the Confederacy. People voiced distrust of her Confederate relatives. Right? That's a pretty important point for why people in the North wouldn't like Mary Todd Lincoln. Another piece of supporting evidence that we found, and we see evidence of this in that source we looked at previously. She made large purchases during the war. People disliked her spending. And then supporting evidence 3, she held a grand ball in 1862. And as we read through other sources, we see that people thought she held too many entertainments. Uh, and so there are 3 pieces of evidence. Now, as you see here, these are not opinions, random things that I might have pulled about Mary Todd Lincoln. We, through evidence, saw people voicing their distrust of Confederate relatives. We saw them voicing dislike of her spending, and we saw them voicing dislike of the entertainments. So we have pulled facts out from these sources. Now that you have these claims, you can begin to put it all together. And within your e-materials, you're going to see within your template, you have a place to type in your information. Now, keep in mind what this is going to do is it's going to take everything that you have put for the evidence and it's going to combine it all together into one paragraph. And if you go back and then you look at that thesis statement, you're going to realize, oh, this isn't really a good, clean thesis statement. Now, what do I mean by a good, clean thesis statement? A thesis statement should get to the point. It should not be more than one sentence. It should only be one sentence in length. It shouldn't be too wordy or repetitive. It needs to make sense. There should be a flow to the statement. So, as you look at what the template has put out to you, then you need to consider, all right, how can then I take this statement that the template has given me and edit it down to where it's a nice, clean sentence that really puts forth the argument of my paper? Well, one of the ways you can do that is to use connecting words to make your point. So let's think back to those claims that we had and think about how we can put it together with the initial claim. So here we have some connecting words. Illustrates how or why, contributed to, resulted in, as a result of, due to, through, because, since. Here's how the student has put together their thesis statement or their claim in this first example. First, they begin with the initial claim. Overall Northern opinion of Mary Lincoln was low during the Civil War. Here's the connecting word, due to her Confederate relatives, her spending habits, and her entertainments. Now you see previously when we had those supporting claims, we had 1 or 2 sentences. Here we've made it very to the point, but it still delivers clarity and it's going to make our reader want to read more. It's also going to help our reader understand where we're going with our argument and where we're going to be going with the paper too. In the second example, we see that the supporting claims have been listed first by the student. They've used because to start out with and says because of her Confederate relatives, her spending habits, and her entertainments, overall Northern opinion of Mary Lincoln was low during the Civil War. So there's that initial claim falling at you at the end. As you see, there's not a rule about when the initial claim, if it should come first in your sentence or last. What you're really going for is flow and what you think sounds best within your paper. Take this third example. Mary Lincoln's Confederate relatives, her spending habits, and her entertainments resulted in Northerners holding an overall negative opinion of the president's wife. Or example 4. Newspaper coverage of Mary Lincoln's Confederate relatives, spending habits, and entertainments illustrate why Northerners held an overall negative opinion of the president's wife. Again, all of these examples are good examples. They are to the point, they include the initial claim, they include the supporting evidence, and they're a single sentence in length. And this is something I really want to emphasize to you before we close out and as you're moving forward. Remember, at any time when you are working on milestones or the final project, you should be working on it within your e-materials. This is going to result in your paper being properly formatted. And it's also going to help you make certain that you're using the proper sources, that you are structuring your paper in the proper way. It's a great way to learn how to put an analysis paper together. So make certain you're using those templates. If you have any questions after watching this webinar, please visit the History 113 114 Learning Community. It can be found by accessing your class, going to the left-hand navigation column, and selecting Learning Community. If you don't have any questions after finishing this webinar, even though, feel free to come over, follow up, post in our learning community. Tell us what the most useful thing you learned from watching this webinar. And here's an extra point too. If you come to the learning community and you like to be able to look at the PowerPoint that was used within the presentation, you'll be able to go to our files section and pull up the Make a Claim webinar very easily. That way you can have those connecting words right in front of you as you work on your own thesis project. If you run into any problems or questions along the way, please be in touch. I am happy to assist.